Hey folks, this is Mr. MegaManFan, and this is Homebrew Review. Like, share, comment, subscribe. You know all the things to do. Today, I'm going to look at Arduboy Homebrew game. And to me, this is a fun idea because basically everything on the Arduboy is a homebrew game. These are all games made independently on an open source platform and given away free by their designers to anybody else who owns an Arduboy to play on their systems. Now, today I'm going to rate the games that I'm playing on a scale of 1 to 5, but I want you to keep in mind that my scale reflects the fact that I'm playing this on the Analog Pocket through the HDMI dock. And some of these games are clearly designed to be used in Tate mode when holding the tiny Arduboy, which is about the size of a credit card, and if you rotate it in your hands and play it vertically instead of horizontally, some of these games would be much better than they are played through the dock. But I'm going to give you the experience of playing them through the dock, through the core that was designed for the Analog Pocket, because quite frankly, the Arduboy is constantly sold out on their website and through various resellers. It goes for exorbitant amounts. So at this point, if you want to play Arduboy homebrews, you probably have a better chance of playing it through the Analog Pocket, through the dock, or through the actual Pocket itself. And I suppose you could turn it to the side and try to play Tate mode, but it's really not going to work that well because the Pocket is bigger than a credit card. So you're going to have a big fat end sticking out on one side. It's going to be very awkward to use those controls. So I'm not saying you couldn't do it, just that you'd be looking at things left to right that are meant to be looked at top to bottom. So it would be very strange, as you'll see in a little bit. But this game, Arduman, is very clearly meant to be played horizontally because it is a clone of Pac-Man. And the maze can't be a one-to-one match, probably either for copyright reasons or the design limitations of the Arduboy itself, but it's a pretty effective clone. Some might even argue this is better than Pac-Man for Atari 2600, which is not really faithful to Pac-Man either, but I like it for being a maze game for what it is and not for being an actual Pac-Man game. And I could say the same about Arduman. I would give this a 4 out of 5. My only complaints are that sometimes the AI for the monsters gets stuck while they're chasing you and they just stay in one place forever, as you can see here in the top middle. And also, there are times where I would like the monsters to run away, and they don't. They continuously follow you, even when you pick the power up where you can eat them. And that's where the similarities to Pac-Man really end, because in almost any clone or authentic version of Pac-Man, if you get powered up, the monsters run away. And in this one, they very definitely don't. So if you expect Pac-Man AI, it's kind of broken. But for what it is on a system that's very underpowered and designed to be really small, it's actually really fun. And if I had an Arduboy, I would probably pull the credit card out whenever I was waiting in line for something and play a game of Arduman. It's good in short bursts, and it's even good for longer sessions when you're sitting in front of a dock with a pocket. So that makes it a win on both counts. I think this is probably one of the best coded and designed games despite those AI problems. So 4 out of 5. Next up on the Arduboy Homebrew Review, we have an attempt at Joust called Joustish, which I want to like more than I do, but I'm only giving it a 2 out of 5. Even more so than Arduman, the physics are wrong. The flapping is way off. When you pick up the enemy eggs, you brake to a halt instead of running through them. And it's hard to land on platforms when you can't mash the button correctly to joust the way you expect to. If you had never played Joust before, you might be okay with this, but the lack of sound and the wrong physics, 2 out of 5. Can't recommend it that much. The same can be said for Millipede, 2 out of 5. It's an attempt at Millipede, but The lack of sound really hurts here because the sounds of Millipede and Centipede are iconic, and I'm having to play a game that was designed to be used in tape mode horizontally. Doesn't work for me. Tinyvert, I was going to be as skeptical of this as I was of the previous two games, but this one surprised me. The controls are very intuitive, which does not always happen with Qbert or Qbert clones. Some of them make it really hard to jump from one spot to the next, but Tiny Qbert gets it right by intuitively assuming what you want to do. If you hit left and there's an empty tile up, you go up and left. If you hit down and there's an empty tile down and right, you go right. If you hit right, you go right. It intuits what you want to do from the controls, and it just works. And there's not much real estate for an entire Qbert pyramid, which is why, of course, this is called Tinyvert. But for the little that it has, it gets a lot of things right. The physics of it feel natural. There are the rotating discs that you can jump off of to take you to the top of the platform. There's actually a coilie that chases you around the maze. You can't get him to follow you off onto a spinning disc, which you can in the arcade version. That gets you extra points. You can't do that here. But they even have variety in the pyramids, such as the tiles that, when you jump on them, change back to their original color. So the jumping twice levels are here. And I assume if I keep playing for longer, there might even be a third pattern where you have to change the tiles 2 times, or a third time changes them back to the original color. And there might even be the enemies that jump down the platforms and erase the color changes that you've made. So there's actually quite a lot packed into Tiny Qbert. And if the sound was a little more appealing and it was just a little more polished, I'd probably give it a 5 out of 5. But of the video, this is my second favorite behind Arduboy, 4 out of 5. Now, I had high hopes for something called Pocket Fighter, but the name is deceptive. It's not a clone of Street Fighter or a belt fighting game of any kind. This is simply an enemy stands there and shoots at you, and you shoot at him, and each time it gets a little faster, and whoever's faster on the draw wins. This is about as simple gets. The graphics are not appealing. The sound is non-existent. The challenge is not there. This gets my lowest score, 1 out of 5. I commend the programming effort because making games is not an easy thing to do, but that doesn't mean it's fun to play. Next up is a game called Squario, or maybe Squario, depending on how you pronounce Mario or Mario. It's up to you, whatever region you live in, how you say it there, but I'm going to say Squario because I've always said Mario Brothers and Super Mario Brothers. That's just my dialect. And this game has all the things you would expect from a Super Mario Brothers clone. It has pits to jump over, enemies to jump on top of, question blocks to break open to get power-ups when you go from a small square to a tall square. Kind of gives me Thomas Was Alone vibes, but obviously you're not really collecting power-ups and stomping on enemies in Thomas Was Alone, but the squareness is definitely reminiscent. Maybe if Boxy Boy was a Mario game, that's what this would be like. It's making me giggle to think of these comparisons, which is a good thing. You want games that are whimsical and entertaining, and Squario is not only that, it actually has some surprising depth for an Arduboy game. Like, if you're paying attention, you'll notice there's actually parallax scrolling here. There's scrolling in the foreground for your Squario and the things he's jumping over, but there's also a background that scrolls at a different speed. It's not quite as obvious in this first level, but it becomes really apparent when you go down the pipe to the second level. Everything about this feels good. The physics take a little getting used to, but once you do, it's really tight to control, really fun to play. There's, again, surprising depth to things like the music. You wouldn't expect a full soundtrack, but For a simple melody that's made from piezoelectric speakers in the actual Arduboy itself, it still holds up when you play it in this form on the Analog Pocket. I wouldn't have expected that. They actually have a real melody here. As you can see what I mean, this scrolling is impressive. The different speeds the foreground and the background are moving at. That is impressive for any homebrew, not just Arduboy. This one gets my highest score, 5 out of 5. Next up on our list is Ardubullets, which, given the name, you would expect bullet hell, and it doesn't disappoint in that respect. I have to dock it a point, though, because it is pretty hard to play this game. It looks like it's designed for a vertical mode, but it has text that's written horizontally, so it feels like a complete mismatch of styles. If it was meant to be played in Tate, then the text would be rotated that way too. So I get confused by it, and I'm going to dock it another point because it's really hard to see the enemy bullets against the star background that's scrolling behind it. It's impressive visually, but it's confusing as a player. So I think there's merit to Ardubullets, and it's one of those games where you can actually play it multiple times in a row because it's sort of addictive in its frustratingness, but it's better than Joustish and not better than Squario or Arduman. So in the end, that means it's a 3 out of 5 for me. I can recommend it, but it's not my favorite out of all the games that I've played today. I just wish that the designer had made up their mind whether or not it was supposed to be played horizontally or vertically, and then it would be easier to tell you that this game was well put together. It also feels like it takes way too many shots to kill the enemies, and maybe if it was a little easier to destroy them, it wouldn't be such a bullet hell, but then it wouldn't be called Ardubullets, would it? Now, our next game is both incredibly stupid and incredibly simplistic, but in its stupidness, it's actually entertaining for very short amounts of time, so I'm going to give it a 2 out of 5 on that basis. This is called Chicken Launcher, and there's nothing else to it other than you time the power gauge and hit the button. You hit it once for horizontal, you hit it once for vertical, you try to get as close to the top of each bar as you can, and that's how far your chicken will be launched. When I managed to do both perfectly, the chicken went an astounding distance, and you'll see that in a moment. And for the sheer whimsical effect of seeing a chicken go for miles, I kind of dig that, but it's not really a game of any kind. It's more of a tech demo than a game. It just shows what you could do if you wanted to make a game like this on the Arduboy. 2 out of 5 short bursts of fun. Let's take a look at Ardenia, which is very much an attempt to do a Zelda or an Ys style game. But the problem with Ardenia, well, there are several problems. First of all, you don't have any weapon when you start out, and there's no it's dangerous to go alone, take this type moment where you get a weapon to defend yourself. So that doesn't help. Also, your objectives are entirely unclear. Like, there seemed to be a key there, but I couldn't get to it. There seemed to be some chests, but I can't get to them. There's a crack in the wall, but I can't get through that. It's very mysterious, which is good for a side-scrolling or a top-down style, whatever you want to call it, Zelda-ish game, but it's just a little too frustrating in its ambiguity. And even though it looks nice and it's obviously got some depth, my inability to accomplish anything makes me want to give it, I'm going to say, a generous 2.5 out of 5. Even one sign that you could read on the road saying, go here and collect this weapon would make it better. Incidentally, if you noticed screen tearing in that game or in Squario, among others, that's typical for side-scrolling games on the Arduboy, and I'm told that effect is exactly the same on the real thing. It has a very low refresh rate, so you're going to get screen tearing even in a core that's authentic to the original, because that's what it would do on the original. Now, in Not Just a Hat Rack, you're playing a hat named Carlville for some reason, and I'm going to give this one a 3.5 out of 5 because I like the challenge, but I am going to freely admit that some people will absolutely hate the physics here because the hat is not just jumping, you are kind of throwing the hat in the air. Like when you get airborne, you kind of fling yourself towards the hat rack. And sometimes you have to use walls and wall climb like Mario or Meat Boy and then make the jump. And then because you are flinging yourself through the air, landing on the platforms when you fling yourself can be very hard to do. You can either underthrow or overthrow the hat and completely miss the target. Then they add levels with spikes in it, and if you touch any of the spikes, the hat dies. So yes, Meat Boy vibes are very much in effect here. If you like the frustration of playing levels over and over again until you can beat them, this is fun, which is why personally I give it a 3.5 out of 5. But I'm going to just acknowledge up front, you may not like it, you may hate it, and the frustration level may get even higher when you don't have any sound of any kind to give you feedback on how well or how poorly you're doing. There are no sound effects, there's no instrumental, there's just a hat. He either makes it to the hat rack or he dies on his way there. You get no sensory input of any kind other than your hand on the controllers and the sounds of the buttons clicking and the D-pad moving, and that just may not be enough for a lot of people. So I guess you could say I'm docking it a point for the difficulty and a half point for the lack of sound, but 3.5 out of 5, still pretty good in my book. This is the kind of game that personally, I would play if I was standing in line at the post office. If there were 10 people in the queue ahead of me and I had some packages to mail, I'd set them down on the counter, I'd pull out an Arduboy, I'd start playing this, and I wouldn't care how many times I was repeating a level. I would just be happy for the distraction until I finally got to the front of the queue and was able to weigh my packages and mail them. This is exactly the kind of game you want in a situation where you're stuck and have nothing else to do, which is what mobile games on cell phones seem to be really good for. And that's kind of the Arduboy without the cell phone features that you would expect. It's just the games. You're not making phone calls, you're not sending texts, you're just playing tiny games on a tiny system to kill some time. It's all of the time wasting with none of the frills, or maybe it's all of the gaming with none of the cell phone contracts. You decide which one you want to call it, but to me, this is what an Arduboy would do best. And if the Pocket was a little more pocketable, I know that's an ironic thing to say, right? Then you would really love it for situations like this. But I suppose, since I've already said that, there are pocketable type devices like Anbernic that could probably run an Arduboy core if you could boot them up in Linux and somebody had made an Arduboy core for Linux. I don't know if there's an Arduboy core for Linux or Windows or anything else, but I know there's one for Analog Pockets, so that's all I have to go on right now. But then again, if it works on Analog Pocket, it would probably work on Mister. And if it would work on Mister, then I imagine it would work on any Linux device with a powerful enough set of chips and enough RAM and the right input controls. I've got to think this would be doable on something like an Anbernic. So maybe give it a shot if you can't get a Pocket, because you can probably get an Anbernic these days. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. Thanks for watching.